welcome to another episode of I See Data People. And here with us is Tom DelVecchio. Hey, Tom, great to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here.
So, as far as introduction, Tom was the founder, CEO, and chief research officer of ETR, where he developed super unique data set utilizing his network of thousands of the world's top technological leaders. Tom has since invested in several prominent fintech startups, and I'm proud he was also one of our investors in my former company, Lagoon. His ideas and advice had a great impact on me and my journey. And actually, he's now embarked on a third phase of his career with the exciting new venture of FC. It was really important for me personally to have him here, invite him, and share his experience and insights so it would reach more people. Tom, really great to have you here.
Thank you for the kind words. It's my pleasure to invest, and I'm thrilled to be here and help with your next chapter.
Thank you so much. Let's go. Given your extensive background in connectivity and fintech, you have a great view into the evolution of the data industry. What has been the biggest surprise in how the industry has evolved over the recent years?
To be honest, my biggest surprise is probably the lack of evolution. The problem, in part, I think, is trying to sell to a group of people that are used to being sold in a particular way. So, if you really think about the two largest constituencies or consumer data consumers as of now, it's largely been what we'd call Wall Street or financial services, with hedge funds, mutual funds, private equity funds, venture to a certain extent. And then, of course, which is kind of the golden goose, people want to kind of radiate to corporate, right? Which is where everybody wants to go now. But historically, data's largely been in Wall Street. And so a lot of people, because they spend fast and they spend a lot, go to Wall Street first, like we did, and go to the hedge fund space and go to the mutual fund space, or what is referred to in Wall Street as the buy side. They go to that group, but they have historically, and almost I would say institutionalized, have been buying equity research. So from years and years of bulge brackets, call it a JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, etc. And now, of course, all of the market research groups and boutiques, not unlike, myself when I was at ETR, Enterprise Technology Research, they have a certain way of buying. And it's typically through trades, through soft dollars, through broker votes. So when you bring in this data group and you think about, all these data providers, the concept of even being a data provider per se as your singular core function is kind of novel and new. It's largely been, and it still is, I don't know what the percentage is, but I'd argue it's at least 30% of all data providers. It's a secondary product that's being generated from their core competency. And so they're typically trying to sell like a software sale. And a software sale and an equity research sale are not the same. So you have people that are trying to sell an ELA, a multi-license agreement, consumption-based models. And you have buy-siders saying, I've got $25,000 hard, and over that I need 7 people to vote, and it's done annually, and you need to talk to my procurement team. And that's just on the research. And then you get even more kind of down the channel to data specific within, because that all comes from the research budget, right? So you've got that whole research budget, which is, call it 1% of total assets under management they're willing to spend on their research budget. And of that 1%, that's going to your traditional research, like an equity analyst at what used to be like a Think Equity or Goldman Sachs, selling a research report because they initiated it on Microsoft, whatever have you. And now a portion of that is for data. So that to me has been kind of my biggest thorn in my side, has been seeing the lack of evolution where the two groups have been able to come to a common ground on an appropriate kind of set of deliverables and pricing that doesn't have to fit into, well, that's how we pay JP Morgan. How can we figure out a way to pay you like we pay JP Morgan?
I think that's a fascinating response. In particular, the lack of evolution really ties to, I think, a question that we all ask ourselves, which is, are data consumers actually making full use of the data they're purchasing? And how close are we to the tipping point where they might be able to utilize that data in unique and insightful ways?
Okay, so that to me is like a two-part question, right? So first and foremost, are they using it for actionable insight or maximizing it? And the short answer is no. There's not a chance. We are at like the precipice of proper data consumption for usage. Now, if you think about that second part, like, the unique, are they utilizing it at a tipping point? That's kind of the problem, right? Most of the buyers, and again, going back to the Wall Street or buy side model, they're expecting you to spoon feed them. And, a lot of people that were, I think I had at one time about 150 hedge funds and mutual funds as customers that typically had about an average of 4 seats. And so a lot of them have heard this from me. And so my joke is I used to refer to the buy side as veal. And I know that sounds very condescending, but what I meant is they want to be spoon fed. They don't want to move. It's pure muscle atrophy. They're caught in their little cages looking for you to spoon fed them. So they're almost still, and this is still a big problem, they're still looking for you to spoon fed them the information rather than getting their own insights. Now, going back to, are they making full use of it? No. And that's really simple. They lack the personnel and the human capital still. I would say that maybe 25 to 30% of all mutual funds and hedge funds in the world even know how to hire a head of data. And maybe 50% of them have a person that has some sort of head of data, chief of data title. And of the 50% of funds that have a person with that title, maybe half of them know what they're doing. The rest of them were like a former data founder or data salesperson, right? Or they were a data scientist for 2 years after college and like, oh, they'll figure it out. But they're essentially buy-siders trying to hire buy-siders, and chief data officers aren't buy-siders. And so they have to think differently. So at the end of the day, to maximize and get insight for the purchase, you've got to be able to originate, evaluate, negotiate, procure, implement, and maximize the data. And they don't have the staff that knows how to do those steps. So no, I don't think they're there. We've got to get to the point where people are staffing their funds appropriately. Then once they staff them appropriately, then they can start to say, okay, what's our process to evaluate and procure, implement, and then maximize? Therefore, they're creating signal from the data assets and the data stack they've created, because that's what it is. It's a data stack. So they've got their internal data stack of research resources. They've got their external data stack, which is third-party data researchers or data providers, as well as third-party equity researchers who create data. There's also the information they're getting from Bloomberg terminals, as well as directly from management, right? When they're large enough shareholders, they have direct access to the CFO, CEO, and they're getting that information. That's their mosaic. So you think about that mosaic as a stack of data. And they need to start creating signal instead of looking to be spoon-fed, because they're buying data because they heard it's good data. They need to know what you're saying because everybody else knows what you're saying. So they know they need to subscribe. Then they subscribe and they say, okay, you look at this data the most. Tell me what are the best 3 ideas in the data. And that's not the way it's going to become ubiquitous.
Tom, this is super interesting. And let's try to turn this around a little bit and onto the data vendor side. From your experience, how do you think data insight should be priced?
Right. So great question. So long-term view. So if I put the VC hat on, who thinks 15 years and beyond, or so they claim, I would say that it needs to be consumption-based like software. So we've already passed the threshold many years ago, maybe called 2014, where there was large cloud adoption, right? So, off-premise compute, right? With Azure, GCP, AWS. And so now they're very used to consumption-based models. And that's become very prevalent in SaaS microservices, a lot of B2B, which is where I lived and still live. But that's too far away. So let's talk about like what can be done now and should be done now. First and foremost, I think it should be subscription-based. If it's not subscription-based, what are you doing? I don't even understand what you're doing. So I can't even have that conversation. And that to me is a big red flag with any data provider that comes to me looking for a check. If you're not planning to be a subscription-based business and a recurring revenue model, you're not really living in modern times. So let's put that aside. Once you say you're subscription-based, to me, there's 4 levels of subscription. And we implemented this at ETR and it worked effectively, which was the no subscription. So you have essentially a marketplace of prepared reports and data assets that they can buy off the shelf from your website. Okay. And therefore you can get that 4,000 transactional sale without a relationship, without a customer success person, without a salesperson, without a commission to your salesperson. So you can retain that full 4,000 without giving up 15 to 20% or whatever it may be. And now you can really maximize the ROI on those sales. And if you market it correctly with SEO, you can actually sell that pretty well, right? Because if you're collecting data on, like we were, 600 vendors, and you're pragmatically producing 100 reports every quarter, you can hang those assets online and have them purchased. And that doesn't require any really upfront cost. So now you've got a data vendor. So like Splunk is coming to your website and buying that data. So if you're covering tech, and that's a great new sale that gets you in to a land and expand model for corporate. Then, and you can also do that with the smaller hedge fund that wants to trial you. So instead of a free trial, they can buy a report on a name they care about and they can see how it was effective, right? Because here's 35 pages of how we've been right and what we're predicting now from the current data set. So then there's the next level, which is kind of the low level subscription, which actually has a price. And that's typically going to be more what I would call more of a pull model. So this is based on your credentials and password. This is what you have access to on our portal. You don't really have a customer success person. You have a rep, but we're trying to keep that to a minimum to be effective with the cost. And there's certain things that are gated off from you. And that's just the way it is because you're at this level. And that's an even better way to walk them up from the non-subscription subscription to the first actual and paying an annual subscription. So now you've knocked down the door to the procurement team or the broker liaison. And now you're in the house and you're set up for success because it's just not a one-off transaction with a corporate card with the no subscription. The next level from there is the all-in. So this is you have access to everything. You have a customer success person and everything's there for you and it's pull. So you can pull it off the site. It's in an AWS bucket. You can pull data. And that's great. And that's where you're going to see probably, that's what I would say in Goldilocks world. That's like the bed's not too soft, not too hard. It's just right. The porridge is not too hot, not too cold. And most people are going to live there based on price and value, right? That nice little intersection. But really where you want to go and what you're going to get out of your quants, sorry, World Data, but like people like World Data and people like that really value data and work with data directly, they're going to want an open API. And that's going to be your top tier. You're at this point, the world keeps going there, but there isn't 100 shops like that you can sell to. There will be soon enough. There's still probably 50 or less shops that can afford the right ticket price and have the internal skill to be able to pull that open API. So as your data comes in, whether you're a real-time live data vendor or you're a captured quarterly vendor, they can pull that data. And in that way, there is a competitive advantage because those bigger shops, and again, that's not shocking, and that'll be the evolution of the space. The shops with more assets under management have more resources. They have better staffing. They staff more people that can handle this. They're set up for success with this technology background so that they can set up a proper data stack and they're absorbing it correctly. And if they can even afford the open API, even better, because now they're beating you on microseconds to implementing that data into their programs and placing trades. So there's real value there. But again, that's really for the big fish, and that's kind of how the big fish stay bigger.
So Tom, you've been outspoken on a few things so far in this interview, but I got to know what's your most controversial opinion?
Wow. Okay, so I got to pick one, right? Because people think of me as a contrarian, which I am, and I don't do that to be, devil's advocate who says, you say it's cloudy, I say it's sunny, black, white. I do it because there's really no reason to talk about the consensus. We already know it. Why rehash the consensus and waste time talking about it? So I would say, the one thing that people talk about, and it's a well-discussed obstacle, is backtesting. Every hedge fund, mutual fund, corporate team has a different way to backtest. They don't want to tell the vendor how they're backtesting. The vendor wants to tell them how to backtest it. The vendor wants to provide their own backtesting, so you don't need the backtesting, so they can accelerate the sales cycle. And none of it's really working, right? This is a huge problem, but this problem is well documented, and we can talk about it if you want. But for me, it's data standardization is the one that's less talked about and probably the most controversial. So if you really want to own the buy side space, which is kind of where data has lived for the last 10 years, right? Since I've been doing it. And, myself, I'm arguably with a few other guys, the OGs of data sales on Wall Street since like 06, 05, right? So if you think about that space, which is a mercurial space, right? because the buy side changes their minds and now they move to another sector and they don't want to renew. And then you have a problem with renewals on subscriptions. And then you got to deal with their investors because they're wondering about retention and churn. So it becomes this kind of, problem on both sides of the marketplace between investor and client, and your clients are investors. If you assume, okay, we're going to get that space, but you're going after that golden goose, which I think people like Yipit and Tigis have identified, and maybe M Science and CB Insights have really identified, which is corporate, because it's a larger TAM and there's more use cases over the longer term as data providers can really augment and evolve what they're delivering, right? As people start creating data companies just to produce data and not as a secondary byproduct of their core competency that we discussed before. What we need is standardization. And that's a big thing. So if you think about, most data, if you say most controversial, if you think about most data, it's non-compliant and therefore worthless. The truth is, you have a compliance team that's always going to evaluate the vendor. But often there's so much in that methodology that's black box. There's a lot in there that's not compliant. And forget if it's not compliant. It's just an awful, fraught with problems methodology where they're, surveying 20,000 people in Asia, or they're collecting data points of where cell phones are, or they're looking at parking garages, or they're tracking planes, or whatever it have you. There's so many ways that can be off. And there's so many ways you can't even really verify that the data you're buying is accurate and not just made up in a lab. And so that to me is the biggest problem. And I'll tell you why. Because I do believe, not unlike any free market where there's negotiation, and you can use the analogy to professional sports, the consumer, the hedge fund, the mutual fund, the corporate, is using these what I would call low value or bad data providers as their justification of keeping the pricing elasticity down as a headwind on the good providers. So you'll have a great provider with a great data set who said, this is what it costs. And they'll say, we don't pay that, and we don't pay that this quick, and you'll have to work with us because here's the examples of the things we've gone through where we signed up for a year, and after 3 months, we realized we couldn't trust the data, and it was wrong. Then we dug into the methodology, and it turned out it was 2 hamsters on a wheel and not actually an engine in a Ferrari. And that comes about. And so the vendor that truly probably needs to make $60,000 to $100,000 to be a successful company, right, and to deliver great, clean, actionable data is probably being pushed down by 20, 30% minimum. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem because, I feel like to a certain extent, the consumer's caught up in the problem because they use it to their advantage. So it's helpful to them in their procurement. It's helpful to us to negotiate with the Cadillac dealer that we had such a problem with a Nissan, and that's why I'm not willing to buy this add-on or that upgrade or agree to that interest rate, because I'll leave right now. I'll go across the street and an Audi will give me this. And the provider needs to say, no, stay here. Try it out. Let's bake in an uptick in cost for year 2. But they're going to bake in an opt-out in the last 30 days, and then they're going to renegotiate. So you're never going to get the renewal, and that booking is never going to become a billing. And that's a problem. So I think that's kind of controversial because everybody wants to talk about backtesting, and people want to blame the data providers. But I think a lot of the problem is there's good providers and bad providers, and the good providers are being punished for the sins of the bad providers. And the consumers of data are happy to have that problem because it's advantageous to their budgets.
This is super interesting, and I want to take us 5 years from now. You've talked about the current problems, the current situation. How do you view the biggest change in the next 5 years in the data industry?
Well, the data industry, I believe, will continue to mimic the software industry. And so if you look where software has gone, it's become, and this is something I published on greatly for years and was, picked up by the Wall Street Journal and all those fun guys for years, most notably on the cloud providers and then Zoom and Slack, is at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of consolidation. And that consolidation is going to be driven by the commoditization of data. The more bad providers you have, the more failures you have, But there's going to be a Tegas, there's going to be a Yipit who are smart and strategic, and they're thinking about acquisitions that are immediately accretive, and they're going to buy those books of business, and they're going to buy that data set, even though they know there's only 5% of that data set that has value. And they're going to bundle into their existing data set, and they're not going to get rid of it, but they're just not going to put a lot of resources. They're kind of almost call it an ELO, an end of life to 95% of the data. And they're going to bundle that in so they can get the clients and get the stickiness and make it immediately accretive. And so what you're going to end up having is, the big guys. So you're going to end up with like, and I don't think this is a negative thing. You're going to have the winners, which will probably be like a Yipit, and it's going to be, it's going to be a Tegas, and it's going to be a CB Insights, and they're going to be plucking off the small data providers that have become commoditized. And so it's going to be very analogous to Microsoft and Amazon and Salesforce picking off the Slacks and the LinkedIns and these companies that really can't survive on their own, because when they go into the Slack example is great. When they said, hey, we're going to go in, we're going to disintermediate Microsoft for productivity and collaboration, everybody said, that's great. Let's buy Slack stock. But what our data caught was the people that were all Microsoft shops, the CIO, CTOs, their Microsoft shops were saying, no. Microsoft's going to come out with something and it's going to be bundled in for free. So why would we pay Slack $100,000? It's exactly what happened. And Slack ended up getting acquired by Salesforce for the same price they listed on the market about a year and a half prior. I see that happening in the data space. And so you're going to go see this. Right now, it's very fractured. It's very disparate. And there's going to be a lot of consolidation. And you're going to have vendors. And those mega vendors are going to be very analogous to the Microsofts and the Amazons.
So Tom, I know you've got a new venture. I'd love to know a little bit about how are you utilizing that to help data vendors and entrepreneurs, and tell us all about it.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So, I was sitting on the beach after leaving ETR and I was debating, what do I do next? Do I open a restaurant? Do I become a full-time dad? All those things were not obviously legitimate ideas, but they sound great on the first day you leave a company after 15, 16 years. And, I ended up brainstorming and kind of just having like an open dialogue and exercise with one of my former clients, who was a portfolio manager at Point 72, a fellow named Scott Albery, and who's a really respected investor who was a big user of our data, who used our data very effectively at ETR. And, we were thinking about like, what's one of the biggest problems in enterprise tech? And so if you think about like the consumer space of tech, that roadmap of how you get from idea to marketplace has been solved, right? You've got Y Combinator, you've got 500 startups, you've got Capital Factory in Austin, Texas, and they're very good. And there's more. And apologize for not remembering every great consumer tech accelerator, but from an enterprise perspective, hadn't really been solved. The accelerator is really the enterprise is not going after a 26-year-old founder who's building the open table. It's going after probably more like a 35 to 40-year-old founder who just spent 15 years at a technology company, and they have an idea for a problem and a pain point in the enterprise that the Chevrons, the JP Morgans, and the DoD are dealing with. And they're building a solution for them, whether it be productivity or security, cyber, et cetera. So we're thinking about, how do you kind of cross that chasm from ideation and enterprise to being in the market? And, what we kind of stumbled upon and then started to ideate and build out, and then we launched just in last December, was what you need to do is you need to start with the customer. And luckily for us, I've been surveying 5,000 CIOs and CTOs in the enterprise for 15 years. So I kind of activated and mobilized this group saying, hey, I know a lot of you guys act as advisors to venture capital firms now. And it's very much of a push model. We have this in the portfolio. We want you to work with them. Are you interested? But what if there was a pull model? What if there was more of a eHarmony, Match.com type of model, right? I'm not trying to dismiss what we're doing, but what if there was a much more pull-like model where they could evaluate and validate initially the new ideas and the solutions that people are working on or about to work on. And then once you could validate that there was a need, a real problem, and a really good idea to solve that problem, then assign the people that said it was a good idea to working with that company. And what you're able to do is you're able to augment and basically pre-populate the future sales pipeline. Because now these 300 CTOs think that's a problem and that's a good solution. So if these fellas solve that solution over there in Kansas, Austin, Silicon Valley, Boston, we can bring it to them. And they've already got 300 self-selected parties that have said they're interested, and some might even want to advise as technical advisors. So now we can really start to iterate and build the product, get the product market fit right, get the go-to-market strategy down, get the IT stack and the cybersecurity solution down. So now it's truly like Global 2000, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 ready from day one. So they can immediately start their business with hopefully a couple of paid proof of concept in the enterprise, which is really what the VCs want to see for a true pre-seed, seed, and Series A. So we started doing that. We built a tool for it, which we called the Rapid Review. So, we're getting several hundred applications a month. We're not able to work with them all. We're going through an initial screening process now. The winners, so to speak, of that initial screening process are going into these Friday Rapid Reviews. And then on Friday, these bite-sized ideas are being sent out to this audience of thousands of CIOs. They're basically scoring it in a low-fatigue, quick way through an app. We're getting all that data, and we know who to move forward with. And then we can start syncing up the interested parties with the founders that are building that solution and start augmenting and just really hyper accelerating their journey. So it's really of an accelerator program rather than an accelerator. It's very enterprise facing. And obviously there's data in there, and I think we've got now about 32 names in the portfolio since less than 12 months. And a lot of them are data driven as more and more corporate buyers are become data consumers. But it's not only that, obviously. There's cybersecurity in there. There's productivity. There's collaboration. There's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of microservices. So it's been a really fun thing. What I love is that it's a very dynamic job because I get to wake up and look at the new data every week from my old research days and say, which are the names that scored the best? Who got, 90% thumbs up from hundreds of people on Friday? Who wants to meet and work with them? Is there some commonalities when I crunch that data? Does it show that it's really US financials? Because there's a certain problem that needs to be solved for at the JP Morgans or the BOAs, right? And how are they solving that really resonates? What really resonated it with the way they're approaching solving the problem? And then I get to work with them and advise them and coach them. And I was an athlete and I'm a coach now for youth sports, with lacrosse and football and basketball. And so I enjoy that kind of advisory coaching aspect, and so does Scott, who's very active also in lacrosse. And so what we'll do is talk to them about, how are you raising capital? What do your docs look like? What round are you in? Who are the VCs you're talking to? What is the value you get out of that relationship? Why that valuation? How are you scaling the team? By who you're hiring and using proceeds of raises? What are they going to solve as you grow? Who are your partnerships going to be? And so I've gone through all that, right? As a multiple time serial founder, entrepreneur, I've gone through that. And with Scott's background as an institutional investor, he really understands how a company should be built so it's ready to go public, right? And so he knows we can build these companies really to be enterprise grade from day one with all the technical assistance we get from the CIO community and all of the financial assistance we get from Scott and the resources Scott brings, which is really like a publicly traded CFO perspective. And that's what we're doing. So anyone can go to the website. FC just stands for, it's the physics for centripetal force. We look at the equation, the mathematical equation for centripetal force, which is FC equals mv squared over r, which is mass and velocity over radius. And so we kind of break that down to enterprise. So it's like, centripetal force to us, mass and velocity is the size and speed of the company and their product and how they can scale and augment the product. And that is being divided by the radius, which we look at as the proximity or space between the CIO customer from the product and company. So we're trying to collapse that space with our community. And therefore, by collapsing the radius, you're increasing the centripetal force, which hopefully ends into, when the process ends, they have enough force to create escape velocity. And that's what we're doing in a nutshell.
Tom, this was great. I think to continue your story of FC, you are definitely a force I want by my side. Thank you so much for this interview. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.